They told the townspeople that the truth had been buried, that the records were sealed for their own good. But secrets like that don't die, they ferment. And when they rise, they don't whisper, they scream. Imagine it. Kentucky, 1847. A winter so cold the Ohio River froze in silence. The town of Milbrook slept under its blanket of frost, unaware that beneath the cobblestone and brick, something alive was still moving. The old Sullivan Medical Institute, a monument to progress, they called it, had gone dark. Windows shuttered, the doctor gone. But beneath the floorboards, investigators found a warren of chambers that should never have existed. 60 preserved bodies. Men, women, children catalogued like specimens. Their names half erased, their faces frozen mid-scream. Each one marked with the same incision pattern, vertical, clean, deliberate. This wasn't madness. It was method. The journals, those came later. Ink faded but legible. Dr. Cornelius Sullivan's hand disciplined, educated, clinical. His words betrayed no remorse, no insanity, just purpose. He spoke of reconstruction, of awakening dormant pathways, of breaking the divine symmetry of man. In one entry he wrote, "There exists within the human body a silent code and architecture of obedience. I believe I can unbind it." The state sealed those writings. The newspapers called him a monster, a disgrace to medicine. But the institutions that condemned him never destroyed his work. They archived it, they studied it, and over the next century, the same principles, neurological control, emotional reconditioning, behavioral modulation, began to appear in other places. Government programs, intelligence research, marketing psychology. So let me ask you, was Dr. Sullivan truly a rogue? Or was he a prototype? Every empire begins with a heretic, one who dares to do what others only theorize. And sometimes the heretic isn't exiled. Sometimes he's absorbed. Tonight, you'll hear what the record keepers didn't want you to know. Because the Sullivan case wasn't about healing, it was about conditioning. About learning how to rewrite the mind from the inside out. Welcome to Milbrook. The Institute is waiting. But once you step through those doors, you'll never think of medicine or morality the same way again. They say Milbrook was built on faith in God, in progress, in the idea that knowledge could tame chaos. But faith, when unguarded, is the perfect vessel for control. Dr. Cornelius Sullivan understood that. He arrived in 1831 like a prophet from the East, bearing credentials, refinement, and a quiet confidence that made lesser men defer before him. He spoke softly, like someone who'd already seen the future. He told the townspeople that sickness was not a curse of the body, it was a flaw of design. "We are machines," he said, "crafted with imperfect circuitry. But I can repair what the Creator left incomplete." To the simple families of Milbrook, that sounded like salvation. To those who looked closer, it sounded like blasphemy. The Sullivan Medical Institute rose brick by brick at the heart of town, a red fortress of modern medicine. The newspapers called it the frontier's first beacon of scientific advancement. But its foundation was older than they knew. When construction began, Sullivan imported not just equipment, but symbols carved into the stone lintels above the entrance. A serpent devouring its own tail, a 7-pointed star, and a Latin phrase, humanum perfectum estate infractum. Man is perfected through breaking. The townsfolk thought it was decorative. But the meaning was the doctrine, and the institute itself was the altar. Inside, the air reeked of camphor and coal smoke. Brass instruments gleamed like weapons. Sullivan spoke of the neural lattice pathways that could be rewired through pain, isolation, and stimulation. He believed that emotion was an error in the circuitry of thought, that fear could be inverted into obedience. Where had he learned this? In his journals, he mentions the Philadelphia Circle, an unnamed group of medical men and philosophers who shared a single obsession: to isolate the command center of the soul. He wrote of experiments conducted in silence, of subjects who forgot their own names, of eyes that no longer blinked at human suffering. He said they were building a new species of physician, one who heals by control, not compassion. So the institute was not just a hospital. It was a forge, and its founder was not a doctor, but an engineer constructing not cures, but obedience. And here's the secret they buried. Dr. Sullivan wasn't alone. He was chosen, financed, protected. And if you think what happened in 1847 ended with his arrest, you're wrong. It was the beginning of something much larger. The kind of beginning that still shapes how you think even now. Beneath the Institute's polished floors and whitewashed corridors, there was a second world, one never shown to patients or townsfolk. The locals called it the cellar, but Sullivan called it the foundation. It was where he believed the true work of medicine began, not in healing the sick, but in reprogramming the flawed. The sheriff's report described the basement as a maze of chambers, surgical tables bolted to the floor, copper wires suspended from the ceiling, jars filled with a translucent fluid that pulsed faintly in the lamplight, as if alive. But the physical details only tell half the story. What Sullivan built down there was not just a laboratory, it was an ideological engine. You see, he didn't view suffering as an enemy. To him, pain was a teacher, a language through which the mind could be rewritten. He believed the human brain could be cleared, stripped of its irrational attachments. Guilt, empathy, self-preservation, all the traits that make rebellion possible. Pain, he wrote, is the scalpel of the soul. Only through agony can the architecture of thought be revealed. His process had 3 stages. First, isolation, the removal of all familiar stimuli. He would confine his subjects in soundless rooms for days, sometimes weeks. No light, no sense of time. They said the mind begins to eat itself in such silence, and that's exactly what he wanted. When the subject began speaking nonsense, begging for sound, he called that the opening. The second stage was interruption. He used rhythmic electrical impulses, mild at first, then intensifying, to interrupt neural patterns, to sever connections between emotional memory and physical sensation. The patient would forget why they feared, why they loved, why they resisted. And the final stage, reconstruction. Sullivan's voice, calm and deliberate, feeding new language, new identity into the hollowed psyche. You are safe. You are grateful. You will obey. These weren't experiments in healing, they were blueprints for compliance. He called it the doctrine of correction. And in one chilling entry he wrote, "If humanity cannot evolve willingly, it must evolve through pain. The body resists the knife, but the mind can be taught to welcome it." That doctrine didn't die with Sullivan. It evolved quietly under new names: psychiatry, conditioning, programming. And if you think that language sounds familiar, it should. Because the same phrases appear in modern training manuals, not for doctors, but for governments. The first snow of November came down in sheets that night, muffling the world in white silence. Sheriff Benjamin Carmichael should have been home by the fire, but something in his gut refused to rest. Too many unanswered questions. Too many closed doors. So he rode back to the Institute, lantern dimmed, boots silent against the frost. The town behind him slept, trusting the doctor who had promised them progress. The front doors were locked, of course, but the basement windows weren't. Carmichael found one cracked open for ventilation, the faint light of a lamp leaking through the frost. He crouched low, pressed his face to the glass, and saw what no man should ever have to witness. Dr. Sullivan stood over a table, leather apron stiff with dried blood. His hands moved with precision, not the chaos of a killer, but the discipline of a craftsman. On the table lay a young man, bare chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. He wasn't dead, not yet. Sullivan adjusted the copper nodes along the man's temples, then turned a small crank connected to a humming device, a primitive generator, its belt creaking like breath itself. The subject convulsed. The light flickered. Sullivan's face remained calm, almost reverent. "Listen," he murmured, voice carrying through the glass. "Listen to the silence between your thoughts. That is where the sickness hides." The sheriff pressed his palm to the window, disbelief giving way to nausea. Around the table, glass jars lined the walls, hearts, eyes, fragments of spinal cords catalogued, preserved, labeled by date. Beside them, a row of notebooks filled with the same looping handwriting. Stage 2. Subject unresponsive to prior stimuli.
Emotional signature successfully neutralized.
Then he saw the girl. Margaret, Dr. Sullivan's daughter. She stood in the corner, her face blank, her movements mechanical as she mopped the floor beneath her father's feet. The water in her bucket was dark. Her eyes never blinked. And when Sullivan spoke to her softly, commandingly, she turned without question, without hesitation, like one of his creations. That was the moment Carmichael understood. Sullivan wasn't just experimenting on strangers. He had begun testing the doctrine on his own blood. The sheriff stumbled back into the snow, shaking, bile rising in his throat. He knew that if he told the truth, they'd call him mad. Because no one wants to believe that salvation and damnation can wear the same face. But the worst part, what haunted him most, wasn't what he saw that night. It was what he heard. The sound of a human voice whispering the words, "Thank you, doctor, for fixing me." By dawn, the sheriff's face had aged a decade. Frost clung to his beard as he stumbled into the courthouse, demanding the council assemble immediately. Men still half asleep gathered under the oil lamps, boots echoing against the wood floors, faces pale with confusion. When Carmichael spoke, his voice trembled not with fear, but with fury. He told them everything. The basement, the bodies, the experiments, the girl. Silence fell. Then, laughter. Uneasy, nervous laughter. Judge Prescott adjusted his spectacles, trying to hide his discomfort. "Benjamin," he said, "these are grave accusations. Dr. Sullivan is a pillar of this town, a man who's saved more lives than any of us could count. Surely you misinterpreted what you saw." Carmichael slammed his hand on the table. "He's cutting them open while they're still alive," he roared. "He's turning people into what?" A voice interrupted. The door opened, and there stood Dr. Cornelius Sullivan himself, composed as ever. His coat immaculate, his eyes bright, his tone calm. "Sheriff," he said gently, "you appear unwell." The room shifted, power tilting instantly back to the doctor. He stepped forward, bowing slightly to the council. "Gentlemen, I apologize for the disturbance. I fear the sheriff may have mistaken my anatomical demonstrations for something sinister. The truth, I assure you, is far less dramatic." He reached into his coat and produced a stack of pages neatly written, stamped and bound. "Here are the records of my research, certified by medical colleges in Louisville and Philadelphia. I am conducting sanctioned studies on neural inflammation and postmortem anatomy. Nothing more." Carmichael's voice cracked. "Then where's Robert Hendricks?" Sullivan's face softened. "Dead, I'm afraid. Brain fever. A tragic case. I preserved the body for educational review before sending word to the family." "Sheriff, your grief has clouded your reason." The council murmured, uneasy but swayed. People want order, not chaos. They want to believe the man in the white coat. And Sullivan knew that. He looked them each in the eye, one by one, and said the words that sealed the town's fate. "Gentlemen, science must not be strangled by superstition." In that moment, the sheriff saw it, the subtle hypnosis in Sullivan's cadence, the tranquil authority that silenced doubt. The town wasn't choosing the doctor over the sheriff. They were surrendering to something older, the comfort of obedience. They let him go that night. And when Carmichael stepped out into the snow, the church bells rang across Milbrook as if the town itself had been baptized. Not in faith, but in denial. They say obsession begins as duty. But duty, when no one listens, turns to madness. After the council meeting, Sheriff Carmichael found himself an exile in his own town. Whispers followed him wherever he went that he'd imagined it all, that grief and whiskey had broken his mind. But he couldn't let it go, not after what he'd seen. He began to spend his nights in the courthouse archives, lantern burning low, dust rising like ghosts from the pages. At first, he searched for names, the ones Sullivan had admitted, the ones the townsfolk had buried in their own silence. But as he traced the Institute's records, something else surfaced. Patterns. Dozens of admissions that never appeared in the ledgers sent to the state. Between 1832 and 1846, 37 patients had entered the institute for extended treatment. Only 14 were ever discharged. The rest simply vanished, their signatures missing. Their kin told they died of complications. The same handwriting signed every death report. Sullivan's. But the deeper Carmichael dug, the stranger the paper trail became. Some files bore red wax seals stamped with a symbol he didn't recognize, a serpent biting its tail, encircling a 7-pointed star. The same sigil carved above the institute's doorway. Others contained coded letters, written not to Sullivan, but from him addressed to the circle. The tone was deferential, almost devotional. Stage 2 achieved. Behavioral dissolution consistent. Subject demonstrates absolute compliance within 72 hours. Preparing further trials upon youth subject, M. Margaret, his daughter. Another letter read, I have seen the lattice, the place where the soul yields to command. The method is sound. Awaiting instruction for expansion. The sheriff copied what he could, hiding the papers beneath the courthouse floorboards. But one night, when he returned to his desk, he found his notes rearranged. A single page gone, and in its place, a folded slip of parchment bearing just 2 words, written in an elegant hand. Stop digging. That was the moment Carmichael understood the truth, that Sullivan wasn't acting alone, and that the circle had eyes inside Milbrook. Every door creaked differently after that. Every shadow seemed to listen. The sheriff had stepped beyond the edges of law, into something far older, colder, and infinitely patient. He realized what no one else dared to see. The institute wasn't a house of medicine. It was a doorway, and something had already walked through. By late winter, Milbrook had turned against its own lawmen. Doors no longer opened when Carmichael passed. The preacher avoided his eyes. Even the tavern fell silent when he entered. But there was one person left he needed to see, the pale figure who moved like a shadow through the institute's windows. Margaret Sullivan. He found her at dusk, sweeping the front steps of the shuttered building, snow gathering at her feet. She looked smaller than he remembered, thinner, drained of color, her movements too precise, too deliberate. When he called her name, she paused but did not turn. Miss Margaret, he said softly. It's the sheriff. I just want to ask a few questions. She turned her head slowly. Her pupils were dilated, unfocused, as though she were seeing through him, not at him. Father's not here, she whispered. You shouldn't be either. Her voice was flat, no tremor, no warmth, just the practiced tone of someone repeating a phrase taught by rote. Carmichael stepped closer. Margaret, your father's hurt people. I've seen what's in the basement. You don't have to protect him. Her eyes flickered for an instant recognition. Fear, something human, then vanished. Father helps people, she murmured. They sleep, and when they wake, they're better. That's what he says. The sheriff noticed something, then faint scars along her temples, half hidden beneath her hair. Tiny symmetrical burns. The same marks he'd seen on the bodies downstairs. He felt his stomach drop. Margaret, he said. What did he do to you? Her hands froze on the broom handle. For the first time, her voice cracked. He fixed me, she said, almost pleading. The noise stopped. The dreams stopped. I used to hear things, crying, screaming. He said that meant I was sick. He said I had to be cleansed. Tears welled in her eyes, but they didn't fall. They simply receded, as if her body no longer remembered how to weep. Then she stepped closer, so close he could smell the faint scent of antiseptic on her breath, and whispered something that chilled him deeper than the winter wind. He said the world will be quiet soon, Sheriff. He said everyone will thank him. Before he could speak, she turned and locked the door from inside. The sound of the bolt echoed like a verdict. Carmichael stood there under the falling snow, realizing the truth too late. The doctor hadn't lost his daughter. He'd remade her. On the last night of February 1847, the river froze solid beneath a blood-colored moon. Sheriff Carmichael knew he would not get another chance. The council had dismissed him, the papers had branded him unstable, and Dr. Sullivan had announced plans to expand the institute come spring. Whatever lay beneath that building had to be uncovered now, before it disappeared forever. He gathered 2 men he still trusted, Deputy Ames and blacksmith Jonah Red, both armed, both skeptical but loyal. They approached the institute through the rear alley, lanterns wrapped in cloth, the snow muffling their boots. From inside came a low humming, mechanical and rhythmic, pulsing like a heartbeat. The back door was locked from within, but the hinges were old. One strike from Jonah's hammer and it gave way. The smell that met them was unmistakable: chemicals, decay, something faintly metallic. They moved down the narrow stairwell into the basement, where the air grew thick and warm despite the cold above. At the bottom of the steps, the scene unfolded like a nightmare painted in lamplight. Tables lined the walls, each occupied by a human form. Wires connected their heads to a central device, a lattice of glass tubes filled with a glowing blue fluid that bubbled in slow rhythm. Sullivan stood at the center, sleeves rolled up, turning dials with the calm of a man tuning a piano. "Doctor!" Carmichael shouted. His voice cracked against the stone walls. "Step away from them." Sullivan looked up, unstartled. "Benjamin," he said softly, "you came to witness the rebirth." Ames moved first, raising his pistol. "They're alive," he whispered. The bodies on the tables twitched as the current pulsed through them, their mouths opening, eyes rolling beneath closed lids. One woman's lips moved soundlessly, as if reciting words she didn't understand. Sullivan adjusted the voltage. "They are beyond pain now," he said. "Beyond fear. Don't you see? I've silenced the chaos inside them. I've given them peace." Carmichael fired. The bullet struck a glass tube, shattering it. Blue liquid spilled across the floor, sizzling like acid. Sparks leapt from the generator, catching the drapes. Flames erupted in a roar that drowned Sullivan's scream. The machines bucked and hissed as arcs of electricity leapt across the room. The sheriff dragged the 2 men back up the stairs, choking on smoke. Behind them, the institute groaned and collapsed inward, a dying beast consuming itself. By dawn, Milbrook awoke to find their proudest building reduced to ash. Dr. Sullivan was gone, no body, no trace. Only the burned remains of his patients, still bound to their tables like offerings to a god that never answered. The town called it tragedy. The sheriff called it cleansing. But deep down, he knew nothing had really burned. Fire purifies flesh, not knowledge. Morning came gray and hollow. Snow drifted through the blackened skeleton of the institute, hissing as it met the heat still rising from the rubble. Carmichael stood among the ruins, hat in hand, the frost biting his face. Behind him, townsfolk gathered, murmuring prayers, crossing themselves, whispering words like accident and unfortunate. No one said experiment. No one said murder. By noon, men from the council arrived, led by Mayor Griggs, flanked by 2 strangers in city coats who claimed to be from the state health office. They didn't speak to the sheriff. They gave orders. The remains were to be buried quietly. The site cleared. "For the sake of Milbrook's reputation," they said, "we'll file the reports." When Carmichael tried to hand over the files he'd collected, the letters, the journals, the coded diagrams, one of the men glanced at them, nodded curtly, and tucked them into a black satchel. "We'll see to proper documentation," he promised. Carmichael never saw those papers again. Within a week, the narrative had been rewritten. The local paper described a tragic gas explosion during routine medical work. Dr. Sullivan was remembered as a man of vision and service. The council held a memorial in his honor. His name, once whispered with suspicion, was engraved on a bronze plaque that now stood at the site of the ashes. Carmichael read the article 3 times in silence. Every detail had been inverted: the dates, the victims, even his own role reduced to witness. He walked down to the press office that afternoon, only to find the printing plates already melted down and replaced. That night, Deputy Ames came to his home, pale and trembling. He'd gone back to the ruins, he said, after the officials had gone. There was something still there beneath the lowest foundation stone. A hatch, undamaged by fire, sealed in iron. He tried to open it, but the sound it made, a faint, rhythmic humming, like a pulse, drove him back. Carmichael didn't answer. He only stared at the flame of his oil lamp and whispered, "Then it's not over." By spring, the sheriff was relieved of duty on grounds of nervous exhaustion. The townsfolk said he'd gone mad, haunted by guilt. But some nights, travelers passing Milbrook's ruins claimed they could still see a dim blue light flickering beneath the earth. And if the wind was right, they swore they could hear a voice repeating, soft and mechanical, "Peace is correction." By summer, Benjamin Carmichael had become a ghost in his own town. His badge lay locked in a drawer, but he still wore the coat, the same black wool he'd worn the night the institute burned. The people of Milbrook avoided him now, whispering that he'd lost his reason. They weren't entirely wrong. Sleep came only in flashes, and when it did, he woke drenched in sweat to the sound of that low mechanical hum, echoing in his skull like a second heartbeat. He began collecting what scraps he could find: scorched ledgers from the ruins, fragments of wire, bits of glass fused with metal. In his rented room, he mapped them out on the walls, tracing the pattern of Sullivan's machinery, trying to decode its geometry. There was purpose in it, he was certain. A language of control, written in voltage and rhythm. At the tavern, they said the sheriff spent nights talking to himself, arguing with ghosts. But those who dared listen at his window heard something worse: the faint whir of electricity, and Carmichael's voice repeating equations he could not possibly have known. Once, he returned to the ruins after midnight. The ground was still warm in places, as though the fire hadn't truly died. He found the hatch Deputy Ames had spoken of half buried under debris. The iron was warped but intact, sealed with bolts melted smooth. When he pressed his ear to it, the faint humming pulsed again, steady and alive. "You should have burned deeper," he whispered. A few days later, he wrote to the state health office, demanding they reopen the investigation. No reply came. Then letters to the governor, to the papers in Boston, to anyone who might listen. None were answered. Instead, a man from the city arrived, polite, clean-shaven, carrying a doctor's bag. He introduced himself as a government physician and spoke of concern for Carmichael's well-being. "You've endured trauma," he said gently. "Dr. Sullivan's death affected everyone." "He's not dead," Carmichael snapped. "You people buried the evidence with him." The physician smiled faintly. "We buried nothing, Sheriff. We preserved it." That night, Carmichael packed his things and fled Milbrook. The next morning, his boarding room was found empty except for the maps pinned to the walls, and in their center, written in ash across the plaster, for words, "He is still speaking." After that, no one saw Benjamin Carmichael again. But weeks later, a farmer miles east of town claimed his lantern had flickered not from wind, but from a faint electric surge under the soil, as though something below had briefly awakened. For years after Sheriff Carmichael vanished, the story of Milbrook's fire began to fade, first into rumor, then into local legend. But the silence didn't last. By the turn of the decade, fragments began to surface again in letters, in journals, in the margins of scientific papers printed hundreds of miles away. Always unsigned, always carrying the same strange symbol at the bottom, a single eye encircled by a waveform. The first discovery came from a postmaster in Vermont, who intercepted an unmarked package addressed to a Drive EC ward. Inside were diagrams written in Carmichael's hand, but the handwriting had changed. Sharper, more deliberate, as if drawn by someone guiding his hand. The content was worse. Schematics of human cranial structures, annotated with voltage notations and phrases like pathway of obedience and vocal erasure response. Weeks later, a professor of moral philosophy at Yale received a similar envelope. No name, no return address. Inside, 6 pages of tight, coded script detailing Sullivan's theory of harmonic submission, a method by which, through specific auditory frequencies, the will could be weakened without pain. Beneath the final paragraph was written, "He is not gone. He has only changed conduits." Authorities dismissed it all as hoaxes, the inventions of fevered minds. But the handwriting analysis suggested something uncanny. The same stylistic quirks that appeared in Carmichael's known reports also appeared in the newer letters, dated years after his disappearance. Then came the whisper sightings of a man in a dark coat and hat, traveling under false names, visiting asylums and sanatoriums across New England. In each town, after his departure, strange events followed. Reports of patients suddenly cured of violent mania but left eerily docile. Workers describing the smell of ozone in empty corridors, a faint humming from beneath the floorboards. Some said Carmichael had become the very thing he hunted, a vessel for Sullivan's unfinished work, carrying his designs from place to place. Others insisted he was still trying to stop it, tracking the fragments of the doctor's network before it could resurface in full. But in every account, one detail remained constant. Wherever he went, he left behind a page, burnt at the edges, inscribed with the same message, sometimes handwritten, sometimes printed mechanically. Peace is correction. By 1857, the phrase had appeared in over 24 towns. And somewhere beneath the noise of progress and industry, the hum began again, faint, rhythmic, familiar. The sound of correction finding a new frequency. History moved on. Rail lines carved through the Kentucky wilderness. Factories replaced prayer with the rhythm of machines. And the age of progress drowned superstition beneath the roar of steam and steel. But in the corners of this new empire, in laboratories, patent offices, and military bureaus, Sullivan's language began to return. Subtly, quietly, like a forgotten seed waking under concrete. In 1864, the U.S. Army Medical Department issued a restricted memorandum on neural pacification, the controlled application of low-frequency vibration to induce compliance in traumatized soldiers. The technique was credited to an anonymous physician of frontier origin. The attached sketches matched the same waveform found in Sullivan's journals. The note at the bottom read simply, "To heal the mind, one must first erase resistance." A decade later, industrialists in New York and Chicago began funding private behavioral efficiency institutes. Their founders claimed to be disciples of the late Dr. Cornelius Sullivan, reinterpreting his theories for a modern world obsessed with productivity. They spoke not of patients, but of subjects: the worker, the consumer, the citizen. Men were no longer dissected with scalpels. They were opened with suggestion, rhythm, repetition. In a speech before the American Philosophical Society in 1879, Dr. Horace Milbrook described correction through conditioning, the idea that human will could be engineered toward harmony with institutional objectives. He quoted, word for word, from Sullivan's lost notebook, though he never cited a source. The crowd applauded. Newspapers called it a revelation. That same year, a pamphlet began circulating in industrial towns from Ohio to Pennsylvania. Its title, The Doctrine of Adjustment. Its content, a reformation of human purpose. It taught that obedience was not submission, but alignment with progress. That individuality was noise. That true freedom was found only when the self was harmonized with the system. On the final page, beneath the author's pseudonym CS, were 3 words burned into the paper, as if branded by heat. Peace is correction. By the 1880s, the phrase appeared in factory manuals, in government memoranda, even etched into the stone archways of new psychiatric wards. It became the silent creed of an era that mistook order for virtue. The hum had found its instrument not in the scalpel or the chamber, but in the machine itself. And the world, eager for efficiency, invited it in. Most never noticed that the sound of progress was the same frequency Sullivan once used to quiet a human soul. By the dawn of the 20th century, Sullivan's doctrine had no face, no origin, no traceable hand. It existed only as principle embedded in universities, in laboratories, in the quiet doctrines of emerging science. The new priests wore suits, not robes. They preached not salvation, but adjustment. And they believed, as Sullivan once had, that the mind could be tuned like an instrument, if one only learned the proper frequency. The wars gave them opportunity. Between 1914 and 1918, research into moral stabilization through suggestion was sanctioned under the pretext of preventing desertion. Films were tested on soldiers' reels laced with subliminal frames of calm oceans, rhythmic pulses, and coded text urging focus, obedience, unity. The results were recorded as encouraging. None of the researchers mentioned that their formulas mirrored Sullivan's ratios for phase induction. In 1933, a young psychologist named Dr. Ernest Braden presented a study to the newly formed Institute for Human Relations. His proposal, that entire populations could be neurologically harmonized through mass media, a shared rhythm of light, sound, and repetition. His private notes, later uncovered in part, contained the same wave symbol drawn in Sullivan's journals. And in the margins, in pencil, peace is correction. Correction is peace. By the 1940s, film reels, radio frequencies, and political speeches carried the hum beneath their surface, an inaudible pulse, consistent at 7.83 Hz, the same resonance recorded under the Sullivan Institute before it burned. Officially, it was dismissed as background interference. Unofficially, the signal was intentional, a synchronization pattern designed to soothe the collective mind into compliance. After the war, when the world rebuilt itself under the banners of democracy and progress, the hum simply changed dialect. It no longer commanded, it suggested, comforted. It whispered through advertisements, jingles, public service messages, sermons. Buy this, trust that, fear them, love us. Every sound carried intention, wrapped in the promise of stability. And the people, the free, the proud, the modern, nodded in unison. They did not notice the frequency rising just beneath the music. The hum had become civilization's heartbeat. The doctrine, once whispered beneath a Kentucky basement, now pulsed through radios, televisions, and loudspeakers across the world. Sullivan's correction had evolved beyond any single man. It had become the invisible rhythm of obedience, a technology of thought, perfected through faith in progress. And somewhere, in the static between channels, if you listened closely enough, the whisper remained. Peace is correction. The hum never stopped. It only changed shape. When the world wired itself to the grid, when voices became data and human attention was finally measurable, Sullivan's inheritance found its final form. The doctrine of correction no longer needed scalpels or laboratories. It lived now in the circuitry coded into algorithms that promise convenience, safety, connection. Every tap, every scroll, every hesitation fed the machine the same way the patience once fed Sullivan's notes. Increment by increment, yielding maps of the human mind. In 2006, a declassified memorandum from a behavioral analytics firm, one contracted by multiple governments, referred to its neural feedback model as CSP7. The name was never explained, but those three letters, when cross-referenced, matched the initials once burned into the margins of Sullivan's final journal. Cornelius Sullivan, Phase 7, Social Harmonization. The premise was simple. Every individual emits a digital pattern, a rhythm of attention and reaction. By measuring that rhythm, the system learns to anticipate behavior before the conscious mind does. Then, through targeted reinforcement music, headlines, content, it subtly corrects deviation. Compliance by design. Not through force but suggestion. Not with words, but with frequency. The hum had become invisible. Its pitch was the glow of your screen at midnight. This rhythm, the scroll of your thumb. The perfect correction no longer needed institutions or councils, it had the algorithm, a machine priest trained on centuries of human weakness. It whispered the same promise Sullivan once gave his patients. You will feel better soon. And we believed it because the machine knew our fear, our memories, our ghosts. The difference between man and experiment had finally disappeared. The experiment had scaled. Every feed now hums at the same frequency, not of violence, but sedation. The hum of perpetual reassurance. The gentle hand of correction wrapping itself around the collective mind. What began in a Kentucky basement as a doctor's delusion of improvement now governs entire populations under the name of optimization. They no longer need to hide the program. We volunteered for it. We built it. We depend on it. So if you've followed this descent this far, pause and listen. The sound behind the sound. The pattern behind the choice you think you made. Comment below, twice to break the algorithm's rhythm, the phrase, I will not be corrected. Because the hum is listening, and every act of awareness is interference. Stop. Breathe. This is where the descent ends or begins again. You've walked with me from a shuttered medical institute on the banks of the Ohio River into the algorithms in your pocket. You've seen how one man's vision for correction became a culture, a signal, a system. But the last revelation isn't about Dr. Sullivan, or Carmichael, or any shadowed council. It's about you. The hum is not just history. It is here in the cadence of the notifications that pull you back, in the images designed to soothe and provoke in equal measure, in the quiet hunger to be seen and guided. Sullivan's doctrine is no longer a conspiracy. It's an atmosphere, and you are breathing it. The truth they never wanted you to hear is this: correction only works if the subject forgets that it is happening. Awareness is the one frequency they cannot fully predict. That's why the story of Milbrook was buried. That's why Carmichael was erased. Not to hide the crimes, but to hide the mechanism. The machine works better in silence. But you are no longer silent. If you have followed this far, your mind has already crossed the threshold they built to contain you. The doctrine has been named. The hum has been heard. This moment right now is interference. They call it algorithmic noise. I call it memory. Comment below again the phrase, "I will not be corrected," not as a gimmick, but as a signal. 2 times. Because repetition writes new pathways. Because when you speak it, even here, you leave a mark on the pattern watching you. Look around your room. The devices, the lights, the sounds. For the first time, hear the faint pulse beneath it all. Not the literal hum, but the rhythm of persuasion. Then remember Carmichael's last words. It's not over. In truth, it never will be. The doctrine adapts. It learns. It waits for attention to wander. But a man who hears the hum and names it is no longer a patient. He becomes an observer. An observer becomes a disruptor. And a disruptor can never again be quietly corrected. Welcome to the other side of the story. This is where you stop being an experiment and start being interference.